this week you've become the center of attention for your take on the Kyle Rittenhouse trial and verdict, and what we should do moving forward from that verdict. But first, I think we should just start with some of the things that perhaps we agree on, and then we can move to some of the things that are more controversial and that we might not agree on. So I think the verdict itself, right? You believe that Kyle Rittenhouse being found not guilty for a reason of self-defense in the 2 killings and the 3rd shooting was the proper outcome. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason actually, in my mind, it all flows from the first. Everything flows from that first shooting. So in the first shooting, it became pretty clear early on that, and the video evidence was pretty clear that Rittenhouse was being pursued by his first victim very aggressively, and he was actually in the act of retreating. So here he was in a circumstance where he wasn't an aggressor from the video evidence that you saw early on. He was actually in the act of retreating from somebody who was pursuing him. Now, the real question there was, if you're armed and somebody who is not armed is aggressive towards you, that doesn't give you a right to shoot them. You don't have just because you're carrying a weapon and someone attacks you in some way doesn't give you a right to shoot someone under the law, because the law is essentially, and Wisconsin's no different in this, that you're supposed to have a proportionate response. And so if somebody shoves you and yells at you, you just can't pull out a Glock and empty it into their chest. You have to have a reasonable, and this is the key word, reasonable fear of death or grave bodily harm. And so sometimes when a person who's unarmed is attacking, you might have a reasonable fear. Sometimes you won't. And so the circumstances depend, or it greatly depends on the circumstances. And I think the defense introduced evidence that really, I think quite obviously made the jury really concerned that had Rittenhouse not fired his weapon, that that first attacker could have seized it, used it against Rittenhouse. There was evidence that that individual had been quite aggressive during the evening, that he, there's evidence introduced that he'd actually threatened to kill Rittenhouse. And so when you have that kind of evidence, it raises the stakes. And the reason why I said everything was really hinged on that first shooting, if that first shooting was not lawful, then what happened afterwards is cast in a different light as well. So if he's walking away or trotting away from a murder, then the individuals who then moved on him at that point, it casts their actions in a different light. And it casts Kyle's actions in a different light. Now, if it's not a murder, as the jury found, then, Kyle's situation as he's running down that street is quite different. And so the key in that case, to me, was that first shooting. And once that first shooting was found to be self-defense, I think everything else flowed from that.
Yeah. We had a legal expert who practices self-defense law in Wisconsin on the previous episode of the podcast here, John Monroe. And he actually had the same take as far as the importance of that first shooting on the entire case. And I understand that. I think that makes a lot of sense in a certain degree. Of course, obviously, just because that first shooting was in self-defense doesn't necessarily mean that each subsequent shooting automatically is in self-defense. Obviously, you still have to look at the individual actions to determine whether or not he was reasonably in fear for his life and acted with a reasonable level of force in response to what he was attacked with. And obviously, the jury found that that was the case. And I think based on the video evidence that we saw all along, it probably was the right conclusion. Although it is interesting, I think, to look at the motivations of the people after the Rosenbaum shooting, the first shooting, because, it's probably fair to assume that they did think that he had committed a murder and was trying to flee the scene. Now, to be fair to Rittenhouse, he's running towards the police in this scenario. So perhaps those people, you shouldn't have intervened at all and let the police handle it, but you're in an atmosphere that's a riot atmosphere, and the police didn't come down towards them until after the next series of gunshots being fired.
Well, here's a bit of a mind bender about this. So you're exactly right. The fact that the first shooting was lawful did not automatically render the next two shootings lawful. But if the first shooting was unlawful and he had just murdered somebody, then when you're moving away from a murder, like just imagine, say that you've held up a convenience store and you've shot the clerk, and you're sort of running out of the convenience store and somebody intervenes to stop you. I don't have the right to shoot the people who intervene to stop me, right? And so if he just murdered them, if he murdered Rosenbaum and he's running away, then it casts his own ability in the continuation of that event to shoot in a totally different light. But the fact that he didn't murder Rosenbaum and the jury found him not guilty of that means he's not a murderer running away, right? Mm-hmm. Now, here's the mind-bending thing. It is entirely possible for one of the two guys, if they had been able to sort of wrestle away the gun, or the EMT who was shot in the bicep, if he had fired first and killed Rittenhouse, it's probable he could have mounted a self-defense argument in that circumstance, because he was operating under the presumption that Rittenhouse had just murdered somebody. And when you've got a person you presume to be a murderer running with a weapon out in the open, then is it reasonable? Is it reasonable to fear injury or grave bodily harm from that person? So there's this really weird, there's a very strange way in which different parts of the law function together that can create circumstances, and this is something that's kind of mind-bending to a lot of people, where there can be legal gunfights. I'll give you an example, the Breonna Taylor situation in Louisville. So Kentucky has a stand your ground law. That means that if somebody comes bursting into your house, unless you know they're law enforcement, unless you have a reason, unless it's reasonable for you to know that they're law enforcement, you don't have to retreat, right? You can open fire. But if you're law enforcement and you're serving a warrant and you burst into someone's house and they fire on you, you have the legal ability to return aimed fire at that location. So that's exactly what happened. Is somebody burst in the door, not the homeowner, but the boyfriend who was there, pulled a gun, didn't know who was there, hadn't heard any identification. The evidence is that he hadn't heard any identification as police. So he fired a single shot. Once he fired, which was lawful, the police had the ability to fire back, which was lawful. And there you have it right there, a legal exchange of gunfire. And that's how the sort of this weird quirk in the law where that something like that can actually occur.
Yeah. And there was actually a very similar case to the Breonna Taylor shooting, that the defendant who was charged with felony murder for his girlfriend being killed in a very similar kind of shootout as to what you get just described, where the police officers killed her in crossfire. He was also acquitted under this exact same concept that you're describing here.
Right.
As an African-American gentleman that a lot of people had brought up in the wake of the Rittenhouse shooting. Sure. And so it's a similar situation. I think that is a good point that a lot of people don't really think through with this case on either side. Yeah, self-defense it's a murky thing in terms of, the law might be fairly clear, but when you throw in what's reasonable and what's not reasonable, what does it mean to reasonably fear for your life, and what does it mean to use reasonable force necessary to defend yourself? That's where you get into basically a whole second guessing game. That's essentially what juries do in these cases. And so and you also have to remember that a lot of the circumstances that surround the actual act of the shooting itself don't necessarily matter to the legality of it. They might matter to the morality of it, which we'll talk about in a moment here, as you've discussed in your pieces, but they don't really matter to the legality. The fact that Rittenhouse didn't live in Wisconsin that he crossed state lines. It doesn't matter to the shooter. It doesn't matter that he was there when people believe maybe he shouldn't have been there. That doesn't matter to the legality of the shooting.
Right.
The fact that the Breonna Taylor's boyfriend was, I believe, not allowed to legally own firearms doesn't matter to the shooting. The same thing for this, although people can correct me if I've got that detail wrong, but this most recent shooting I think it was lawful.
I think he was lawful in possession, but I'm not 100% sure.
Well, shooting at the police, right? That the boyfriend was suspected of, or I guess it was her ex-boyfriend was suspected of being, she was suspected of working with him, or
it was an ex-boyfriend.
Yeah. Right, so that's perhaps a different analogy there, but the more recent case where the defendant was found not guilty of felony murder for a shootout with the police, even though that defendant was prohibited from possessing firearms, that didn't matter to the specific self-defense claim against felony murder in this case, because again, this is another situation where he didn't know that it was the police who were breaking into the home. Anyway, the point is that some of these larger questions about whether or not, in the Rittenhouse case, whether or not he should have been there, whether or not he should have gone to the city at all that night, they don't really have any bearing on the actual specifics of whether it was legal for him to shoot Rosenbaum and the other people that he shot that night.
Yeah, I mean, the only the only exception to that might be if there had been evidence introduced that he went intending to shoot people. Right. But even then, you still would have to look at the specific circumstances, and the specific circumstances he's fleeing from Rosenbaum when. And the other thing that was going on also, if you watched some of the video evidence and carefully, was that there was a gun fired in the air right before Rittenhouse turned and shot Rosenbaum. And Rosenbaum didn't have a gun in his hands, but you're talking about an atmosphere of chaos, gunshot fired in the air, guy is running after you, allegedly has threatened you with death, threatened to kill you before. And so this was a circumstance where the prosecution, proving beyond a reasonable doubt the claim against Rittenhouse, was going to be a tall order.